Hello, I'm Jeremy, and today I'm going to be talking about my favorite games of 2019. I'm going to just give some, brief disclaimers, and I'll jump right into my list, or list as the case may be. As I did last year, and I think possibly the year before, when I put together my lists, because of the nature of board gaming, where a lot of designs get repurposed and reprinted and tweaked, I'd like to make a list of games that are either remakes or rehashes or reprintings that I feel like were significant for the year. But then I also like to have a list of an original game titles that really weren't sprung from another design that to a large degree stand on their own. So because of that, I have a short list of 10 reprints or rehashes or remakes, and then I'll have a list of 20 or so games that are original, so to speak. So overall, I think that this year, 2019, was a mediocre year. That sounds down, and I don't want you to think that I'm a curmudgeon in anything, but I've found plenty of games I really enjoyed playing this year, but I found fewer that were great games. I'm not sure how many of the games, even on this list, are going to be perennial favorites, but when I was putting together the list, I really tried to think, is it likely, with the number of games that are out there, that I will be playing this game in future years? So that was really my criterion for coming up with the games I included on this list. So a lot of the games as such have some degree of novelty, or they do what they do better than most other games in the genre. So that's really what I was looking forward to. There's a fair degree of derivative and similar designs, and I tried to steer away from that in putting together this list, or lists again, as the case may be. But ultimately, I would say, don't put too much stock in my rankings. I think because of the relative quality of this, my number one could be number 10 if I put this list together tomorrow, and vice versa. I don't think I have a single standout, absolute, clear head and shoulders above the other game for this year. Although, there's plenty worth playing, and hopefully this video will direct you to some of that. So, with that preamble out of the way, I will begin and talk about my favorite repurposed or rehashed or reimaginings of the year. So again, I have 10 of these, and I guess in the interest of suspense, I will count backwards from 10 and work my way up to 1. I'll try to keep these relatively brief because there's 30 games to go through. So at number 10, I have the game Nova Luna. This is a co-designed by Uwe Rosenberg and Corne von Worsel. And this is a kind of melding of Patchwork and von Worsel's game Habitats. It really is just a streamlining, simpler version of Habitats, which is a game from a few years ago, a tile-laying game where players would draft tiles from a shared pool and try to create situations that would satisfy various animals by having them around the habitat types that they like to be near. Here, the game has been abstracted out and simplified so that essentially each tile wants to be next to different tiles of different colors. And just the solitaire puzzle of trying to put that together in what is now a race to be the first to satisfy 20 conditions on their tiles is pretty satisfying. I think that it's a nice streamlining of Habitats. It's an easier game to teach, and it's one that I enjoy playing. I probably would personally, in most cases, prefer to play Habitats, but this is still a really tight design. I think in some ways the patchwork style drafting that now exists in this game, as opposed to the old game where players would draft from like this weird pool where you would have a figure and you could take what's in front of you or to your sides. That was more interactive, but this is a lot more straightforward, and I think I might prefer that, but I think I probably prefer the more scoring possibilities that were possible in Habitats. In any case, this is a recommended game, one that I obviously put on my list, that is Nova Luna. I think that it is coming out in the US in 2020 from Stronghold, but it was available at this year's Essen. in a similar situation, although I do think this is already available in the stores in the U.S., is Orlean Stories, my number 9. This game, I feel like, to a certain degree, has gotten a little bit of a bad rep, and I'm not exactly sure why. I think that it's because there's player elimination in it, and there is more tightly scripted game flow than there is in the original Orlean, which is pretty open-ended. That's a point salad game. This one, you have to hit certain objectives at certain points in order to win the game, and like, it comes with 2 scenarios, one of them with player elimination, which I think rubs a lot of Euro gamers the wrong way. But I feel like, although neither of the scenarios that are included here are ideal, I feel that it has the potential to be a game that I like more than Orlean once it gets an expansion with the right scenario, if it does get that. Because there are some improvements over the base Orlean game. There's like a modular map that you could alter from game to game and build out and claim territory in your own way. Again, that's confrontational for Euro gamers, but I do think that added interaction does help change up Orlean, which to some degree could feel like a somewhat scripted game because of the low levels of interaction in it, with only the tiles that you pull from the bag being the differentiating factor that was really stopping you from pursuing your given strategy. So this one I've played it enough now that my opinion has increased a little bit each time, and although I don't think that there's yet the ideal scenario for this new take on the Orlean game, I'm really excited by what they might come out with in the future. So this is almost a provisional entry on my list. I assume that they're going to come out with an expansion of it, although maybe the negative reception of it will be so widespread that they'll just call it quits with this. But I'm hoping that in the future they come out with something that really keeps the more passive aggressive or non-confrontational nature of this Euro, and applies it to this new system for Orlean, which is still a relatively novel bag building game. So moving on, number 8. This one's only here because it's a second edition of a game, and I'm not sure. I actually never played the first edition, and I don't know what's changed. So I put it on my rehash list because it's not really a new game for 2019, and that is Dorado Chiang, the second edition of this. This is a Taiwanese game. It's a relatively unique game where you're almost manipulating a match 3 style puzzle in the middle of the board to generate cubes, and then you use those cubes to progress along various tracks, which are going to give you either scoring points or different bonuses, different powers. So manipulating that puzzle, which is shared among all players, so if you change something, you're setting up the next player, is an interesting little game in itself almost. And then the using the cubes that you get to best maximize their worth in the various tracks, which all have cube requirements to progress along. It's just a nice engaging game. It plays in half an hour or so with 2 players, especially if you've played it before. Maybe a slightly longer with up to 4 players, but it's something that I think is novel enough and yet at the same time almost familiar enough because of that almost bejeweled aspect that it has, or that puzzle element. That it's been an enjoyable game. So it's unique to me, but I know that it's a second edition, and I know that they tweak some rules between the first and second edition, so I thought I would include it on this list. So moving on, number 7, I put Azul Summer Pavillion. This is the 3rd game in the Azul series. Azul was my single favorite game from maybe 2 years ago. Probably, I'm not sure that there's been a better game that's come out since it. And this one I think is to some degree a novelty, and I enjoy it, and I think it keeps a lot of the things I like about the base game Azul. And I like the new puzzle that it offers. It gives you a lot of different directions that you could go in if you want to try to complete all of a given number, or if you want to complete entire colors on your board. I just have, as I've played the game repeatedly, I've found that I really prefer it at 2 players as opposed to 4 players, and part of that is because of the way that the scoring works, where the whereas in Azul, you essentially have an automated, after you've done all your tile drafting, you have almost an automated scoring phase, which each player can do simultaneously. Here, that gets really elongated into one person at a time, taking one move at a time, and it really breaks the flow of the game for me. And the second thing that I think holds me back from really being effusive about this is that in this version of the game, because there's so many more things that you could go for, it becomes that much more difficult to be strategically drafting tiles away from other players. Of course, there's wild tiles available in the game, but you can't, beyond that, be expected to pay attention to everybody's player board and pay attention to what they want. Whereas that's relatively easy to do in the base game Azul, which is where a lot of its strategy comes from. So this is a game that I do enjoy. Of course, if I'm including this on this list, I do enjoy it, but it's just a step down from the base game Azul because of those issues. So it's still number 7 on this list. Moving on at number 6, and this is almost like a honorable mention for this series as a whole, which is just continuing to just make me happy every time I play it to some degree. But it's specifically for the Ticket to Ride Map Collection Volume 7's Japan map, which has in it a 2 maps. There's an Italy map, but I'm much more taken with the Japan map because it has a new mechanism where players are cooperatively building across Japan a bullet train, which when you build it, you're going to get points for the player who has contributed the most to it, and the player who's contributed the least to it will lose points, but then all players are going to be able to utilize that train for any routes that they're trying to complete. And that really changes the dynamics of the Ticket to Ride game, which has been through so many map variations at this point that breathing new life into that in any way is still impressive. And that's 15 years or so, if not more, since the game has been invented. And there were the Italy map in that box is totally fine. There was also a good Polish map that was released this year, as well as Ticket to Ride London, which was an improvement on the Ticket to Ride New York that came out a year or two ago, a 10-minute version of the game. So this franchise has just been really keeping new entries coming out without just feeling like it's milking the franchise, and it's been providing me a lot of enjoyment, and I think any given year the newest Ticket to Ride map would probably make this list in some form, but this Japan one just feels like it's something a cut above the average Ticket to Ride map, so that's why it's on the list. And I have another expansion at number 5. Although this is a standalone expansion, you can play the game without owning the other base game. Although I would recommend starting with the base game, and that is the Quest for El Dorado, the Golden Temples. This is a Reiner Knizia deck building race game where players are going to be drafting cards that will let them cross terrain, with the goal of trying, now in this new version, to collect 3 different gems and then return to the start space the most quickly. This is a difference from the original game where you're just racing from start to finish. And that new open-ended structure of the game, I think, is a breath of fresh air for this. It's a really good expansion that both boosts the playability. You can combine it with the original maps and the original cards, and there's just a lot more variety. But it also now adds in a new way to play, which is the best kind of expansion. So it's a game that I felt in its original incarnation just fell short of greatness. Here I think it's gotten a little closer to being a really great game. It's one that I'm always happy to play, and one that seems infinitely expandable, and I'm excited to see if more expansions come out down the line. So moving on at number 4, this is just a straight up reprint, and it is a game from maybe 20 years ago, and that's called Bus. This is put out by Splatterspiel. I believe Capstone is reprinting it, and this, by the standard of Splatter's games, they're known for creating heavy Euro games, is a relatively light game, although that's not to say that its rules light, definitely strategically still deep. You're going to have to be paying attention to what other players' possible moves are. It's a worker placement game with pick up and deliver aspects, where players are going to be using competing bus routes to transfer passengers to their various destinations on the board. Catch being that each passenger, wants to go to one space, and each space could only take one passenger. So there's a lot of manipulating the game state in terms of taking these time tokens, which could change at the last minute where everybody wants to go, or being the person who first gets to lay down. Only a certain number of people are going to be able to lay down new track each turn, so turn order becomes really important in jockeying for that. And at the same time, although it's a worker placement game, you're given a set number of workers that are to last you the whole game. You could place as many as you want in a given round, but if you run out of them and more than one other player still has workers, you'll be sitting out a round, which could cost you the game. So although it's an old game, I played it once way back in the day, but it's effectively a new game to me. It feels fresher than most new games I've played this year, so I thought it deserved a mention, even though it's really just a new reprint with some new art. That is Bus. The number 3 game on my list is Expedition to Newdale. This is on the repurposed list because it is it could be called Oh My Goods, the card game. This is designed by Alexander Pfister, who designed this card game called Oh My Goods, which was an engine building game where players use cards and tried to produce goods that they would turn into other cards for eventually points. And this really transfers that basic concept into a board game. The interesting thing about this game is that it still feels very much like a card game at its core. The board is really just a race to get to a position to make get points before another person for building in a situation first, or it's really just the edge case that's what's going to give you points. And there's some strategy involved in the board aspect of the game, but really it still does feel largely like Oh My Goods, and it feels like a card game. One interesting thing about it, which really justifies it being a full-on board game, although I guess the expansions for Oh My Goods had this too, is that it has a campaign aspect where each time you're playing it has different components swapped in and out. And I tend not to like these legacy or campaign games, but this is the approach to a campaign game that I do really enjoy, which is essentially each time that you're playing, there's just some nice little rules tweaks, almost like you're playing with a mini expansion or something each time that you play, so that you have a new thing to try, maybe something that will shake up any sort of dominant strategies. The only thing that really that annoys me about this game is that the setup is a little bit goofy. Each time you have to pull in certain cards, take certain cards out, and that's a little fiddly. But once you're playing the game, it flows very well. It's pretty logical, and it's really enjoyable. Definitely one of the better games I've played this year. That is Expedition to Newdale. And at number 2 on this list, I have, it's kind of a combination. I have Twice as Clever, which is a sequel to Gauntshon Clever, or That's So Clever, as it's called in English. This is a roll and write dice game, and I also have in this entry the new score pads that they came out for Gauntshon Clever and Twice as Clever. So Twice as Clever is really just a variation on Gauntshon Clever. It's essentially a new score pad which with each color die having new rules. So this is like essentially a combo building roll and write game where you start very slow, but by the end of the game you're going to be with one die drafting action taking 3 or 4 actions, and there's this really satisfying sense of accomplishment once you get that going. And the score sheets in this game are ultimately a bit of a puzzle where you want to figure out like what's the best, when should I go for this color versus that color. It's good to do these early and these later. You come up with these strategies to approach how to best maximize your score. And I know that a lot of people play this on the phone app where they've just played it dozens and dozens of times. Just rolling, playing a 5-minute game on the phone, and through that they just come up with strategy to maximize the score. I don't really play the phone app one, but I've enjoyed my plays of the physical game, just doing the same thing in a much slower fashion. But I have with Ganshan Clever in particular, over the last 2 or 3 years since that game has come out, come up with what I feel like is a pretty good strategy where I can consistently hit well over 200 points, which is a decent score in that. Of course, luck is a factor, as it is in any dice game, but by coming out with these new score sheets, which essentially change the bonuses that you're going to get, although the Twice as Clever one has a few other rules modifications, some small rules modifications. These new score sheets essentially work almost as much as a new game as the switch from Ganshan Clever to Twice as Clever was. Essentially, you have to go through that whole process of figuring out your strategies and what's the best way to approach a given die roll all over again. So it's really been enjoyable playing those games and watching them expand. So really terrific games to begin with, and ones that have been well expanded. I'm not sure how widely available in the US those score sheets are. You might need to import them from Europe, or maybe just find an image of them online and try it once with that. But you will be glad you did, because it really does reinvigorate the game. So that's why it's my number 2 on this list of game remakes. And at number 1, or reimagined, I have for this list is Marco Polo 2, in the service of the Khan. Marco Polo 1, the Voyages of Marco Polo, I believe it's called, is one of my favorite Euro games of the last 5 or so years. And this one takes a lot of what I liked about that original game and just turns it on its head. In that game, you're traveling east to Beijing. In this game, you're starting in Beijing, traveling back west. But a lot of the dice drafting mechanisms and stuff that existed in that game are the same. It's just essentially tweaked in a lot of different ways. That if you've essentially come up with good strategies for the base game, which is hard to do, the first game I should say, you're going to have to reinvent the wheel, because now, whereas in the first game you could kind of just sit at home, not even though it was a game themed around exploration, you could largely stay at home, maybe go to 1 or 2 cities, and then fulfill contracts. Here, because of the way that contracts are gained from cities that you visited, it really forces you to explore more. Overall, I feel like this is a game that feels more friendly than the original game, looser in a lot of ways. And I'm not sure that I necessarily prefer it. I mean, I really held the original in high esteem, but I've really enjoyed my plays of this. It feels like, walking into this game, the first time I played it was, like, meeting an old friend. It was just, very familiar yet different, and it made me excited to explore it. It's a little bit more open-ended, like I said, and I'm not sure that losing that tightness is ultimately for the best, but I'm happy to find out. It seems like it's still an interesting game in its own right, and one that I'm looking forward to my future plays. Again, that's being the criterion of what I'm putting on this list, the things that I think I'm going to be getting to the table the most in the future. So that is my list of remakes and rehashes or what have you. And now I'm just going to jump right into my list of my top 20 games of 2019. So at number 20, I have Escape Plan. This is a heavy game, one of the heavier games on this list. That's designed by a designer who's known for heavy games, Vital Lacerda, and this is probably one of his lightest games, ironically, but that makes it more to my taste than his other games. So this might well be my favorite Vital Lacerda game. It's a game that's themed around a bank robbery, and you're just essentially trying to hide out before you make your escape from town, as the title implies, I suppose. And it has a lot of really interesting mechanisms hashed together. There's a nice grid hex-based map system, and the way that you move across those hexes is interesting. It's not per hex, it's essentially per region, which could change based on the hex layout, how far you can move with a single movement. And then there's some interesting mechanisms where you're essentially trying to visit various safe houses around the board and trying to do this in secret, because all of the safe houses are worth different amounts to different players, so you never know exactly how much money people have squirreled away before they make their escape. And ultimately, the game is played over, I think, 3 days, and on the 3rd day, the players have to escape by the end of the day, or else they're eliminated. And as you escape, the cost to escape goes up, essentially because of police presence increasing. And because of that, you're always trying to, weigh staying around for one more round, getting more money, versus getting out quick and guaranteeing that you'll at least have some points at the end of the game. And that tension really ties into the theme of the game very nicely. A lot of Vital Lacerda's games have what I feel are too many rules for their own good, and here there are still a lot of rules. The game still takes quite a bit to teach for how simple it is, but because it feels thematic, I think I could forgive it. So it made my list as a result. So that is Escape Plan. At number 19, I have Vindication. And this is, I believe, technically a 2018 game, and I actually think I acquired it at the very end of 2018 after I made my 2018 video, so it's on this list. Please forgive me. And this is essentially it was a Kickstarter game, so I'm not sure. I think it delivered to Kickstarter backers earlier than came out at the very end of 2018 retail. And this is a sandbox game that feels very unique in its own in its own way. It's both very Euro cube pusher, converting cubes into other cubes and trying to use cards to maximize points. But at the same time, has this Ameritrashy element to it, where you're certainly with the theme, you're a warrior or whatever, exploring isles, and there's some, when you move onto an isle, a different tile on the island, you flip it up, you don't know what that is. So it feels in a lot of ways like an Ameritrash game. But once you get all those tiles explored, it becomes almost an engine optimization or a point optimization exercise, which appeals to me as a Euro gamer. Essentially, you'll have the layout of the various tiles, which will either let you get cards, which will power you up, or let you convert cubes into other cubes, or what have you. And seeing the lay of the land and figuring out your strategy based on what the random setup for that game is really where the game is here. And coming up with that strategy on the fly, I just find to be really satisfying. And not only that, but it's a game that I've played it now, half dozen times or more, and I haven't even gotten to all the various modules that are in the base box, and then an expansion came out this year, and I haven't even played that yet. So it's a game that I feel like I have a lot of exploring left to do with, and it's one that I've really enjoyed my plays. Despite appearances, it doesn't look like, to me, from the outside, the sort of game that I would necessarily enjoy. It really appeals to my strategic gamer inclinations. So that is Vindication. At number 18, I have a much simpler game. This is Rumble Nation. It's a Japanese game that technically came out a few years ago, but it's being published, in a proper boxed form now by Hobby Japan. It should be available on Amazon.jp. And it is a 20-minute area control game that almost harkens back to the old Saxon game Can't Stop. Each turn you're going to roll 3 dice. You'll take 2 of those dice, and that'll determine which region you're going to be placing in. Essentially, the sum of those dice. There's regions from 2 to 12 on the board. And then the other die will determine the number of cubes that you're going to put into that region. And each player is going to have an allocation of cubes. And the first phase of the game, which is really the only part of the game that has decisions in it, involves placing all the cubes, and it goes until every player's placed all of their cubes. There are a few cards that you could use. You could essentially get to use one card during the game, and those are going to be different each game, and they could change which cubes are present in which areas. But then once all the cubes are on the board into various regions, you start allocating them. The catch is that you start with region 2, which is worth only 2 points to the victor, versus region 12, which is worth 12 points. But the victor of region 2 gets to put cubes in any region that's adjacent to them where they have some presence. So because of that, there's this cascading effect, which is really fun to watch play out, especially for a 20-minute game. And it's one of those things you almost have to play once just to see how it works, so you could, strategize, because it's hard to envision that on your very first play. But it's one of those games that, just for what it sets out to do, which is an area control game in 20 minutes, it has a lot of clever mechanisms, and it has a nice, straightforward, direct rule set, but it surprises you. And I think that's a common theme with a lot of the games I have on this list. I mean, I've been a gamer for decades now at this point, so being able to feel surprised by a game is something I really value. So that is definitely how I felt with number 18, Rumble Nation. And certainly that same surprise comes in for number 17. This is a game by Reiner Knizia, who's been, a game designer of note for as long as I've been a gamer. And this is Takuto, which is a new game from Knizia, which is rather unlike any other game that he's ever put out. This is a game where players are going to be collectively building pagodas of various colors and getting, essentially currency for doing that, and then they'll convert that currency into points. And this game has a unique tactical element to it, where players are going, all the pieces for all these pagodas are thrown into one giant bag, and you have to draw those out blindly, so you can feel the size of the pagoda but not the color. And it's one of those things that when you're explaining it to people, there's incredulous stares around the table, because it's something that feels so goofy that either it's going to be stupid or it won't work or something. And based on the other rules of the game, which you really only have 3 action options on a given turn, and often on your turns you're only going to be doing one action. It sounds so simple and so silly that it almost feels like there shouldn't be any strategic decision making, but somehow because of the different things that you could buy, it turns almost into an engine builder of sorts. And the question of whether to build your engine or to just buy points is there, and there's the entertainment value of just watching people pull things out of a bag and hoping for the right color, and drawing the exact wrong one is palpable in this game, and it's really been enjoyable every time that I've played it. Although again, on paper it just seems like nothing at all. It's somehow much more in practice, and again, as somebody who feels like to a certain degree I've seen a lot of familiar ideas in the hobby, this one just felt novel, and that goes a long way with me these days. So that is Takuto. At number 16, I have another Japanese themed game, and this is Yokohama Dualla. It's again designed by a Japanese designer who designed this Yokohama, which is a game from a few years ago that was almost similar to, is a point salad game, worker placement game that was somewhat similar to Istanbul in its movement mechanism. This one is a 2-player only variant on the game, or not even a variant, it's an entirely new game that removes that spatial element, but really doesn't feel any worse for it. In fact, in this version of the game, the blocking feels much more intense than it did in the original Yokohama Dualla. In a lot of ways, I think that this might actually be my preferred version of the game. Yokohama was a fine game, and I liked it well enough, but this one has plays much more quickly, of course, because it's only a 2-player game, but feels much more interactive than the original Yokohama did. Their blocking wasn't a huge deal, and here it is a huge deal, because effectively the various buildings that you can visit during a turn, each player can only go to them generally once, and that could be crucial. Yeah, at the same time, because it is a point salad game, it doesn't feel too restrictive. You usually have a decent move, even if it's not your optimal move. There's also this unique worker placement mechanism, which is tied to cards, where you have to play your low workers first and then play them sequentially higher, so your least powerful workers first. And because of that, you're always almost grappling with that tension among yourself. Do I do this action so I can do it once, or do I hold off, hope the action doesn't get taken, then hope to play a more powerful worker on it? So it's just a game that feels tense all the way throughout, and it's been really enjoyable every time I play it. It really does feel like a duel, and like I said, I probably do prefer this to the original Yokohama. It's a really terrific game, and I feel like it hasn't gotten the same hype that the original Yokohama got, and that's a shame. I feel like people should check this one out. So at number 15, I have a game that I feel like has gotten a little bit more attention. This is Hodari. This is a card drafting game for up to 5 players. It feels like a relatively streamlined version of Seven Wonders, the popular card drafting game. It certainly has a similar civilization building theme, which is pretty abstract in practice. But it has a unique mechanism where players are going to be drawing two cards each turn, keeping one, and then putting one into a communal discard pile. Then once all the cards are drawn, you go through those discard piles willy-nilly until all the cards have been taken. So that's a really nice, clean mechanism. I like that about the game. And I also like just the basic simplicity of the game. Like essentially you have a few different, even though it's a civ building game, you have a few different tracks that you could progress upon, and there's different reasons to go up on each of those tracks, and including one that you have to feed your people with, so you always have to pay attention to that relative to your other tracks. And somehow the game, even though it's all players are doing the same thing at the same time and incrementally increasing all these different tracks, feel like you could do very different divergent paths, and it's been enjoyable every time I've played it. And it just is very well developed. It's easier to explain than Seven Wonders, and it's just, like I said, like the fact that it's well developed, it feels like, a lot of rules that could have been there have been, cut off. That's something that I generally like in a game, and this is something that almost exemplifies that, so that's why it's on the list. At number 14, I have a game, the Taverns of Kiev. This is designed by Wolfgang Marsch. This is one that I did do a video review for at the beginning of the year, and I feel like over the course of the year, my opinion's gotten a little bit lower on it, but I still rather like it. Obviously, it's number 14 on my list. And this is a deck building game with a slight push your luck element. And an engine building element to it. So players are going to be acquiring cards, some for points, some that let you get free actions, and essentially trying to use those cards to brew the most beer, which will let you buy more cards. So it's essentially this loop you are doing over the course of the game, and because of that, it's felt a little bit samey once I've gotten 10 or so plays into it, which is about what you could expect with most Euros these days. And there have been times where I feel like the combination of either the dice luck or the card luck has, cost me a round, which could have cost me the game, because the way this, Quacks of Quedlinburg, the previous game from this designer, each round becomes increasingly important to your, you'll get more and more points towards your end score as you go. You start small, but, if you go bust in round 7 in this game, or in the Quacks of Quedlinburg, that might upset your whole game, and that luck element, not just being as present generally later in the game, can take a little bit of the sense that this is a proper strategy game out of it. Yeah, it's still one that I enjoy playing, of course, and it's one that I think has enough novelty in it that warrants a place on my list. So, moving onward, at number 13, I have Maracaibo. This is also designed by Alexander Pfister, the designer of Expedition to New Dale. And this is, it feels almost like a more open-ended version of the Great Western Trail. Essentially, there's a board where players are going to be moving pawns circularly around each round. I think it's going to be played over a set number of rounds. But what's going to happen here is that whereas, the Great Western Trail was really a sort of deck builder where you try to create cards that would let you exploit tiles that were on the island. In this version of the game, it's really more of a tableau builder where you're essentially building your card combos in front of you that will let you exploit the various things that you're encountering over the course of the route that all the players are going to be taking. So this is one that, again, like several of these games on this list, has become more and more appealing as I've played it each time. Much like Expedition to New Dale, it's a legacy or a campaign game where players are going to be adding in different components each time they play. And because of that, the game doesn't feel like it has a dominant strategy, and you could essentially keep changing the parameters of the game, and that's really a nice feature in a game like this. Just the little tweaks that you get each game are enough to keep it interesting for me from game to game without, and I don't care about the story cards that you get with the game or what have you. Just the novelty of like having one or two different locations that you could stop at on a map is enough to make the game feel fresh from game to game, and that's almost surprising to me. It does feel relatively loose, and I feel like there's a lot of different strategies that you could take, and that open-endedness does remove some of the tension from the game, but at the same time it's really been pleasurable to play it. And like as I've said, as I've played it more and more, I've just come to terms with what the game is. I've enjoyed it more and more, and that's why it is on my list. So pardon me. So now we are moving on to number 12. So at number 12, I have on this list a two-player only game, another one, and that is Mandala. And this is a extremely short, maybe 5 to 10 minute game, although you can play multiple rounds, I suppose. Stock market manipulation game that has first of all, the components of the game. It has square cards, which are just one of 6 colors, although they have nice little designs on them. And it comes with a cloth play mat that sits between 2 players, and players are going to be, in this game, essentially playing cards to one of the different fields that are on this mat, so that essentially there are restrictions to what colors can be placed into what field. Once every color is present in one of the fields, then it resolves, and players are going to be drafting a color of those cards at a time and putting them in front of them. When they take the first card of a given color, that determines its value. The later in the game that you take the first card of a given color, the more points the cards of that color will be worth to you. So it's almost like you want to delay taking a given color for as long as possible and then get a lot of them all at once. And that little puzzle, or that little manipulation that you're trying to do to make that work out in your favor while the other player is fully aware of what you are trying to do, makes this extremely engaging as a two-player. I guess I would call it a stock manipulation game. And it's been really enjoyable, and it's one that I tend to play back to back to back to back, because it's just that quick and that light, but at the same time that engaging that you want to play it again, because it rewards repeated play. And there's like lots of subtle ways that you can manipulate the tempo of the game, and the hand management is really important, and your hand limit is very tight. Even though you get like 8 cards in it, you want to try and force the other player into making moves that benefit you sometimes. And it's just an extremely enjoyable two-player game. It feels like a classic waiting to happen. There's a similar game, Hats, which came out this year, which it does play up to 4, although with 4 there's a team variant. And but if you want to play a multiplayer version of Mandala, Hats might be one that I would also recommend. But Mandala is the one that's really hit the bullseye for me, so that's why it's on the list. All right, moving on. Number 11. At number 11, I have Cooper Island. This is a game that is rules dense. There's a lot of niggly little rules that you could forget, and the first time you play it, you'll feel like you're struggling to accomplish much of anything. It's a very economically tight game, but again, this is one that, with repeated plays, it's rewarded that, and strategies have opened up, and I've seen more ways to be clever with what limited actions and limited resources you get. Actually, the third time that I played this, I had a rules error where when you place an island tile, you're supposed to get the benefit of that island tile, which could be a cube, or 1 resource cube, or maybe 1 coin. And I forgot that rule, and it made the game so tight that because of the scarcity of resources in this game, the scores in that game were about half of what they were in every other game that I've played, and it was just grueling. But that just shows you, taking away like 5 resources or 5 bonus actions that you get during a game could radically swing a game where resources are this tight. And I haven't really talked about the game. It's essentially, I guess I should say that all these games, I assume that people are familiar with them, which may not be the best assumption, but I put up pictures, and you could look on Boardgame to find out more about these games, I suppose. But this is essentially a worker placement game where each player is essentially placing workers to manipulate their own private peninsula on an island, where they're doing a hex puzzle that generates resources and then uses those resources to build buildings onto their little hex grid. And each person's on their own little solitaire puzzle, and you tend to not really care what other players are doing as long as they're not on your worker placement space. And for a certain type of Euro gamer, I think that this is almost an ideal, because it's so not interactive. You're just focused on your own little thing. Until it becomes interactive, of course, right? Like, because the one person took the one thing that the one space that you wanted to do, now you have to pay them 1 resource, which is a lot in this game. And just the way that the game takes you from this point of like absolute scarcity in the first round, and then builds you up to a point where like it's a low scoring game, that you feel like oh wow, I got 6 points on that play, that's amazing, or 4 points on that play, is really satisfying to a certain perverse sort of gamer like myself who likes wringing blood from a stone. So it's a game that I feel like I still have a learning curve with, which is great. I feel like that's not the usual thing. It's complex enough though that I feel like there are a lot of different paths I could take, and I feel like after 5 plays I could do another 5 plays, and who knows how many more beyond that. And it does feel relatively balanced. I've seen people take different strategies, and still, because of the relatively low scoring nature of the game, people end up in the same ballpark, and that's exciting. I'm excited to play it more, and hopefully with the rules right every time in the future. All right, so now I'm into my top 10. So again, I would just say that rankings are arbitrary to a greater degree than usual this year, just because these are all really good games at this point, but I don't think that they're classics necessarily. So feel free to comment or what have you, but these are just games I would feel satisfied recommending, and I think that's a good way to think of this. So at number 10, I have another heavy game, another heavy Euro game. This is Barrage, and this is also a worker placement game where players are going to be building dams out onto a shared board, and then running those dams to generate electricity, which will convert into points. And this is essentially, although it's a worker placement game, and those are by nature interactive because of the blocking, this is more interactive than usual because there are ways to block each other on the shared board. Essentially, the board is set up that water starts at the top of the board, flows down until it hits a dam. If somebody builds a dam upriver from you, they're going to block you. Your dam's going to have to wait until they process the water for you to get it, although they could ship it off somewhere else after they've processed it and ruin your plans entirely. So there's this really interesting, unique, water flowing mechanism in the game, and then there's also this mechanism in the game where whenever you're using your machines, I think they are, to build, you're going to put them on this time wheel, and they'll have to rotate all the way around this time wheel till you get access to them again. So between that and the way that the water flows work in the game, there's some water that comes out every round, but you're not necessarily going to get it. There's this whole sense of delayed gratification to the game, and trying to work around that is really challenging. I've really enjoyed my plays of this so far, and I've played it, with the base game, and at the time that it came out, they also launched some expansions. I've played I think all of the expansions at this point, and I think any mix of those, with or without expansions, has been interesting and compelling in its own right. The expansions definitely add other options, and you could create like synergies between the different expansion type that wouldn't be possible in the base game, and get a really high scoring game. And looking for those things is a nice challenge, but even just the base game has been really rewarding in its own right, and I think that hones in the player interaction a little bit more because of the way that the blocking, there's fewer worker placement spaces to go around, so there's more blocking without the expansion. So that might be the preferred way to play, but the expansions have been worthwhile, I have to say. Overall, a heavy Euro, and one that I think is more interactive than most Euros, which makes it, I think, an acquired taste, but one that I've really enjoyed. So number 9, third game in a row, is a extremely heavy game. This is Yinzi, the Shining Ming Dynasty. So this is a game that really I feel like has gotten almost no attention, and that's possibly because Spielworks puts it out and it's relatively pricey. But for as good a game as this is, I'm almost shocked that I haven't seen other people talking about it or playing it. I've played it a lot personally, but I feel like I'm the only one who sees how good this game is. It is essentially a game about creating, essentially supply routes as you build farms that will then ship your goods to markets where they become publicly available goods, and then those publicly available goods are going to get shipped to export markets, which again are publicly available ships. So while they're on your farms, they're private, and then they become public, and that's a really unique thing about the game. And then another unique thing about the game is the way that the worker placement in it works. There are certain actions that require like tier 1 workers and others that require tier 2 workers, so you have to go do a tier 1 action before you can do a tier 2 action, and you have to kind of alternate between those, and that flow and the planning required to pull that off is really rewarding. And then just overall, this game, it really reminds me of a game that was one of my favorite games, or the reprint was one of my favorite games last year, the classic Martin Wallace game Brass, insofar as you have both have to come up with a supply of goods and then also a way to ship those goods, and at the same time, whenever you create the supply of goods, it's going to be publicly available to other players, so you have to worry about that. And there are some things about the game that I'm not crazy about. There's these negative event tiles that could come out during the course of the game. I generally just have chosen to not play with those, and I've enjoyed the game, I think, more without them, because the game is already tight enough and angsty enough as it is. Between what other players could do to you, just having random events come out is not great. But in general, this is a game that really rewards clever play, really rewards forward planning. Again, if you like Brass as a game, and I know plenty of people do, I would really recommend that you check this one out. That is Yinsi the Shining Ming Dynasty. At number 8, I have a lighter game, finally. That is Miyabi. This is put out by Haba Games, and it's designed by Michael Kiesling, the designer of Azul. And this is actually, I think, the best game that he's done this year. It's better than the new Azul for sure, in my book. It's similarly a drafting game where players are going to have draft tiles from a central pool and put them onto their player boards, and so there's this puzzle element to it as well. The trick is that these tiles can be stacked upon one of each other, so that there's height to the game, and you get points for the number of symbols that you have on a tile times the height that it is when you place it. Yet at the same time, you want to, over the course of the game, have as many of those symbols showing at the end of the game, which discourages stacking those tiles on one another. So at the end of the game, there's going to be a huge area majority scoring, where you're going to be scoring, the number of symbols that each player has in their row, and whoever has the most gets the most points, etc. And balancing those two things, the instant gratification of those early points or in-game points versus those end-game points, is where the whole game goes. I always lose at this game because I'm focused on building as high as possible, which is a bad strategy, but I am what I am. And yet at the same time, so it's a relatively simple game, but it has just enough restrictions placed on it that you feel clever when you're getting your hard to place tile in the right place. I talked about this in my post-Essen video, and I've played it a lot more since, and it's grown in my estimation since then. It's really held up to repeated plays. Also in the box, there are a number of different modules that you could add in if you want to make it thinkier and add extra scoring conditions and whatnot. So you can make this game really total brain burner if you piled on everything if you wanted to. But even at its most basic level, it's really enjoyable, and it gives you enough to worry about, and enough to think about other players' boards. And unlike the newest version of Azul, here you really can look at other players' boards and say, okay, they have 5 bushes and I have 6 bushes, so I have to keep more bushes on my board than their board, so I get those endgame points. And it really does encourage you, drafting the tile that the other player might need, so that you could get the edge in the majority scorings. So really enjoyable game, and one that I would definitely encourage you to check out. That is Miyabi. At number 7, I have Promenade, which is a game that I almost am apologetic for putting on my list because it's such a small publisher game. There's only a few copies of this. It's a Taiwanese game, and it's almost self-published. It's not, but I think it was a Kickstarter, and there were only a few hundred copies of it made. And I'm not sure how widely available it is and if it's going to come back into print. But it is essentially an economic deck building game where players are going to be buying paintings, and the game has lovely art that was done by the designer of the game. It's in various styles, so there's essentially like landscapes and animal paintings and flowers or what have you, and but essentially each painting has a color to it. So when you buy a painting, of a red painting, for example, the value of all red paintings are going to go up. Those cards are going to go into your deck, and then when you play them in the future, they're going to be serving as currency to buy more paintings. So over the course of the game, the value of all the paintings is going to be rising based on what the group think of the table is doing. So if everybody's buying blue paintings are going to go up in value. So there's this rolling, affluence, so over the course of the game you're just going to get more and more powerful turns, so the engine building of the game affects everybody's getting richer at the same time. There's another option to exhibit those paintings, which essentially gets them out of your deck, which is terrible if you're giving away a super valuable card to exhibit it, but it gets you generally more points for doing that by placing it into the market, and that's a big way you're going to get points. So essentially, it's a relatively simple game by the standards of deck builders, but I think that it has just enough rules that feels like you have a lot of decisions to make. You have to pay attention to what other players are doing. If there were more rules, I probably would like it less. It's one of those examples, but you essentially have to consider, should I keep going down this road, getting more of these paintings, but or should I really focus on exhibiting those paintings for points and dilute my deck? So that central tension exists in the game, and it's really an enjoyable game. I sincerely hope it gets reprinted or picked up by another publisher, because it's really one of the most enjoyable deck builders I've played in recent years. That is Promenade. All right, pardon me. So we are almost done. We have 6 more to go. And at number 6, I have another game by Reiner Knizia. This is Babylonia. This is a tile-laying game from him. And I could have almost put in another game that he also released this year by the name of Aristocracy, which is similarly a tile-laying game. That's actually a tile-flipping game. But this one harkens back to his old classics like Samurai, and also his relatively recent game, Blue Lagoon. It is a game that's divided into a hex grid. Each player is going to have a set of tiles, and on your turn you're generally going to play 2 tiles out to the board. They don't have to be connected to each other. You can just play them wherever, and by placing them you're going to be scoring points in various ways. Or some areas you want to surround, and when they're surrounded, the player who surrounds it gets a token which will score them points every time another token gets taken. Others are just first come first serve. If you place a certain figure into an area, you get to take this tile, which will be worth X number of points. And then there are these other spaces that if you surround them and you have the most pieces surrounding them, you get a special power that other players don't have. So really just this, essentially each turn you're just playing a tile or 2, or in certain cases you can play more, but you're just competing on all these different fronts with players to edge them out. And it's really a compelling game. It plays in like 30-40 minutes, even with a full contingent of 4 players. But there are lots of strategies in it, and like in classic Knizia fashion, it really works well in terms of changing valuations for things over the course of the game. So like I said, there are these tiles. There are city tiles. Whenever you claim them, they score every time a city tile gets claimed. So if you get the first one, I think something like 15 or 16 of those could be scored over the course of the game. So those will be worth 16 up to 16 points over the course of the game. Although there's some risk that if equal numbers of players are around a city, the city tile doesn't get rewarded and all the city tiles don't score. So there's some risk in taking those. And then the second type of tiles are these farm tiles that are worth the number of cities that have been claimed. So they start out worth 0 points, but as cities get claimed, they become increasingly more valuable, and eventually somebody's just going to have to can't resist taking them. And then there are some tiles that are just worth static numbers of points over the course of the game. So all these different things are in flux over the course of the game. And for a game that's so simple in terms of its rule set, it's just instantly rewarding and really curious to see how many divergent strategies there are. This is a game that I feel, again, if my criterion for putting games on this list is that I feel like they'll have legs and I'll want to continue to play them, this definitely meets that criterion. I certainly still am happy to play, Samurai or Through the Desert, and this one feels like a return to that form. Whereas Blue Lagoon from a few years ago was a little bit overwrought in terms of how its scoring worked. This one's just nicely streamlined. It feels like it's more legible from the outset how everything works. So yeah, that's why it's on the list. That is Babylonia. So now it's time for the top 5. So at number 5, I have a game that I think has gotten a lot of hype, and I wouldn't be surprised to see it up for the Spiel des Jahres next year. This is The Crew, The Quest for Planet 9, I believe is the English title. And this is a cooperative trick-taking game. I've done a video on this already. It premiered at this year's Essen, and the English release, I think, is on the way. I know that the translation's already been done. Should be available within the next month or two in U.S. stores if it's not already. This is like I said, a cooperative trick-taking game, one of only a few of those, and it almost serves as a tutorial for the genre in terms of teaching people how to play trick-taking games and how to count cards and how to pay attention to what other players might be signaling when they play a card. But also for experts of the trick-taking genre, it's really satisfying because it allows them to apply those skills that they developed in trick-taking games in a new way. So it's something that works, I think, very well for both ends of the spectrum in terms of knowledge with the genre. And in this game, players are just most of the time going to have certain cards that they have to take in a trick in order to complete a mission. And being able to do this with the limited communication that the game allows really forces you to pay attention to how other players play and maximize your limited opportunities to communicate explicitly with each other. The game definitely reminds me of The Mind from a few years ago, but this is more structured. But similarly to that game, one person who's out of sync with the rest of the group could really throw the game off. And once you find a group that you play well with in this game, it's really rewarding. And just working through these progressively more challenging missions, there's 50 missions included in the box, is really rewarding. And the game, I think, has this sort of the Pringles quality. You just want one more, or Lay's, I guess, potato chips, right? You want one more, and you think you could just keep doing the next one. And I've enjoyed working through this with various groups and playing the game. Certain groups, we just try it a few times, and we've had our fill. But others, we compulsively want to get through to the end. Just seeing how the group dynamics work with the various groups, the things that become latent communication. It's just an interesting game in the same way that The Mind was. And I really like that game, and I really like this game, and that's why it's on the list. So at number 4, I think I have a relatively controversial game. It is a Llama. This is the final, I think, of 3 Reiner Knizia games in this top 20. And this is a really simple shedding game. It's like a Uno killer, I think it's fair to say, where players are just trying to get rid of cards from their hand and have the fewest points in their hand at the end of the round. This game, I think, I discovered it right when it came out in Germany, and I published a video review of it, and then it went on to get nominated for the Spiel des Jahres, and I feel like that was a bit of a double-edged sword for what is a really simple, entertaining, fun game, but stressing simple, because certain gamers I feel that it's a little bit too simple for to be nominated for Game of the Year or whatever, and I feel like there's been a little bit of backlash towards the game, and that's a really unfortunate, because it's really to me an ideal family game. It's a simple filler, but it's executed exceptionally well. It has lots of strategic decision makings in a game that feels initially like you have no say in what you're doing at all. You can either play the card that's been played or play one higher, right? Or draw a card. But it has 2 interesting elements. The first being that you could choose at any time to fold your cards. And then the second being that if you go out, you get to give back a chip. So, that encourages you to take a risk. It also has some cool scoring that if you have multiple copies of the same value in your hand, they only score once. So that sometimes informs your decisions. So even though the game is, on its face very simple, it's one that I've played a lot with non-gamers and really enjoyed it. And it's a perfect game for socializing while you play, and beer and pretzels game or whatever they would call it. And I think that it's I have to say that I could have put out also on the similar level Cabo, which is another enjoyable game from this year that is so simple, but it's again almost a social card game. But this is a perfect example of demonstrating, I think, what is my taste in games, which is essentially not holding complexity of choice as the prime thing that I'm looking for in a game necessarily. I think that entertainment in a game, the entertainment value that game gives you, or just the streamlined nature of a game could be other indicators of quality. So even though I don't feel like, even though I have decisions while I'm playing Llama, I don't feel like they're complex decisions, but in no way do I feel like that takes away from the game. And I really appreciate how much this game does with so little. So I think that that's why it deserves such a high place on my list. So moving on, at number 3, I have a game which is also relatively straightforward. This is Caravan. This is designed by Joe Huber, and it is a pick up and deliver game featuring camels on a grid of, I think, 5x5 grid, where players are just trying to get cubes which spawn on various spaces to delivery zones of the matching color. The trick is that the camels work almost like a bucket brigade, so you'll almost never have, especially for the harder to reach zones, enough camels to get a cube from one space to its destination all in one fell swoop. So generally what you'll have to do is pick up a cube, move it partially along the line, then move the camel from the back of the line to the front of the line, and then move the cube further along. So really straightforward game. There's some luck of the draw in this game. Sometimes the right cube will come out right next to where it needs to go, and so be it. That's the nature of the game. But there's also interactive elements of the game. If you place your camel where another player wants to place their camel, they have to essentially use an extra action to place into your space. There's some stealing done that's possible in this game, although it's limited by the number of tokens that you have. If you don't have a stealing token, you can't steal, and other players know that, so they can take advantage of that fact. And ultimately, it's just like a game that feels like a throwback to the classic heroes from 20 years ago or so that I fell in love with, made me a hobby board gamer. This one just really hones in on the sweet spot for what I like in gaming, and ultimately I feel involved every time I play. I'm trying to figure out as efficiently as possible how to get cube A to space A, and the game is just involving for me without being taxing and without feeling angst or whatever. It's just a pleasant, enjoyable time every time I play it. Also, it's very well produced. I really like the camel meeples. The way that they're designed, they could hold the cubes on their back, or they could stick them under their legs if they're in a position where they can't be stolen. And that's just a really cute design. One of my favorite game components of the year. At number 2, I have Freedom and Freeze game, Fast Slots. This is a pick up and deliver race game. If you told me at the start of the year that I would have 2 pick up and deliver games in my top 3, I would have been surprised. That's generally not my favorite genre, but here we are. So this is basically a game where you have a pawn on the board. It's a sloth, and they're lazy, so they just have to be manipulated across the board by other animals, which will pick them up and then drop them off as they move across the board. So the sloths never move directly, the other animals move them directly, and the way that you move the other animals is by playing cards. So at the start of your turn, you'll be drawing some cards, and you can only take one from each animal type at most. And then you'll play some cards, and then you have to check your hand limit. over the course of the game, the objective of the game is to collect leaves, which are scattered around the map. As you collect those leaves, your hand size is going to get smaller, and also the number of cards that you're going to draw each turn is going to get smaller. So manipulating those decks, which determine how much each animal can move, is a lot of the strategy, and also paying attention to what animals are next to you, and then if once an animal moves you, what other animal can you use to move to the next tree or what have you, and what are other players doing with animals, and where might they leave an animal that you can take advantage of. So it's a very interactive game. It's one that it almost feels like an updating of Elephant Land, which is a game that I love. It's a classic game where you're trying to move to a certain number of spots across a board as efficiently as possible. That sort of route planning is just something I really enjoy in games, and this really does it very well. It has a lot of variety in it. Essentially, you'll have, I think, 12 animals in the box, and you only play with 6 of them each time that you play. And the map itself is modular. You can flip the map around and mix and match the map sides. So it's just a game that feels like overwhelmingly clever, and it's really enjoyable. And at the same time, despite its relative novelty, it has a simple enough rule set that you'll quickly internalize it. You understand how all the animals move once you see them move once. There's like some nice guides that tell you how the animals move, so you can just refer to those at any point. So it's a game that is both chaotic, but it doesn't feel mean. It's a game that has a lot of different unique rules for the ways that the animals moves, but they're very comprehensible. And it's a game that is a race game, but at the same time you're really more focused on your own personal hand management a lot of times. So it's a game that feels like a unique beast in its own right, and that's why it's my number 2. And then at number 1, and again, I think any of these top 5 certainly could have been number 1, but on today, I chose to put this in number 1, is Copenhagen. This is a game that I think combines, for lack of a better phrase, Ticket to Ride with Tetris. It's essentially a game where players are going to be spending cards to buy Tetris pieces to place into a grid, in hopes of being the first person to score 15 points, or to be the person who has the most points at the end of the game, which is generally dictated by the number of times you go through the card stack. The game could end in a couple different ways. And this is like a game that plays in about 20 minutes or so. It has a little bit of a convoluted setup. That's definitely the biggest drawback of it. But it plays very quickly, but at the same time, it has a lot of different routes to victory. You could try to fill in every line, or you could try to build giant columns and be kind of sloppy with your lines. You could do almost like a sort of engine building. You could get little tiles that give you extra bonus actions, and you could build those up in interesting ways and then use those to maximize your turns. Or you could just use, instead of acquiring those tiles, get little tiles that help fill in your grid more quickly and just try to score points that way. And for a game that plays as quickly as it does, it's been very enjoyable to play this. I happened to buy it via the Kickstarter, where it came with some extra expansions. So I've had those from the start. And I also have had it came with acrylic tiles, which are very nice. So I think the retail version of the game comes with cardboard tiles, so I might have a skewed opinion of the game because I have a deluxe version. And I'm not sure which of those expansions come with the base game, so my opinion is for Copenhagen with its expansions. But essentially, you could play with different power tiles each time. You could play with goals that give you an extra point if you achieve them, which changes the game surprisingly in terms of what the possibilities are and what you're going to be going for in a game for that last 20 minutes. And what I really like about the game more than anything is, despite the fact that it's a Tetris game, and there's been a lot of of Tetris variation games, and I tend to like those, but this one stands above the rest of the genre. Because as much as you're worried about your spatial puzzle, you're equally worried about building that engine of those bonus tiles and of managing your cards in your hand. So because of that, I think that it stands above any roll and write Tetris game, or any game where you're just using tiles to do a Tetris thing. It just feels like, although it's cribbing from very familiar sources. It feels like a game that's been, developed, to a fine point. And that's, the first time I played it, I really enjoyed it. And, the most recent time that I played it, I really enjoyed it. It feels like something that is going to stay in my rotations of games, but, indefinitely. And I think that's the most that you could ask for when you're looking for, what's your favorite game from this year? That's I think what I'm looking for. So, again, it's a light game, and I make no apologies for that, but because of what I perceive to be its longevity, and I've already played it maybe 2 dozen times this year. So because of that, I have a pretty good suspicion that's going to have legs going forward. So that is why I've put it at number 1 on my list for 2019. So with that, I guess I'll wish you a happy new year, and I'll thank you for watching, and let me know what you think, and I'll bring you more reviews as I come across more games I feel like aren't getting enough notice. So again, thanks for watching, and have a good day.